Good morning. My name is Jason Isaac, and I live a high-carbon lifestyle. And I think the rest of the world should too. It's fitting that I'm sitting up here ingesting higher concentrations of CO2 than what's in the atmosphere. And I assure you, I'm not going to spontaneously combust, but it's fitting that this is from France, from Paris of all places. We know how the gift that we got from Paris that keeps on giving. It's awful. Cameron mentioned my wife in the introduction, the Honorable Carrie Isaac. It's interesting. My wife was just sworn into the legislature, and she'll be joining us later this evening. She's just sworn into legislature in Texas in January and serves a little bit of the same district that I served in my tenure last decade. But I was just looking at some of the bills that she filed, and I love the captions on this, relating to a prohibition on governmental contracts with Chinese companies. Man. She's been in office for 2 months. I served 8 years, and she's already doing stuff better than I have. She's very competitive, and so it's like she's had to outshine me right off the bat. But let me jump into this, and if we can get it on the screen so maybe you can see it, because I'm looking at it down here, and Mike, our AV guy, has been great in the back. There we go. I love these three-letter acronyms that are getting weaponized really against humanity, but predominantly Americans. And so welcome to a brief journey through the mind of someone with ADD, because I'm going to jump all over the place. And I literally just put this together about 30 minutes ago because I like to hear other presenters and what people are talking about and make this conversation relevant. But these three-letter acronyms up here, I think are some, and I left off intentionally FBI and DOJ and IRS because, I don't want to get taken out and, shoot myself twice in the head. And commit suicide. But the World Economic Forum, the World Trade Organization, the Chinese Communist Party, diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory, environmental social governance. These things are all being driven down our throats against our will to dismantle human flourishing. They want us to take steps backwards and go back into poverty. You look at groups like the World Economic Forum, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, those entities won't allow investments in countries if they're developing infrastructure based on fossil fuels. And to me, that is just, it's criminal, in my opinion. I've had the opportunity to speak with lots of members of Congress over the last few years, and I keep imploring on them, when do the human rights tribunals begin? Because the people, and when are you going to call the people like Bill Gates and George Soros and Klaus Schwab and Larry Fink and Al Gore and John Kerry? When will you call them before Congress to attest for their sins against humanity? Because decarbonization is dangerous and deadly. I love to point out, and this is an Our World in Data sheet, and of course there's awful messaging where the page that this came from, but I added some things. They talk about CO2 emissions being too high. Well, I added parentheses, that's where you have human flourishing. Like, don't tell anybody. But living the high carbon lifestyle is truly the greatest thing on the face of the earth. And I like to tell people that capitalism and fossil fuels have lifted more people out of poverty than anything else in the history of man. And then they put poverty down there. Actually, they use the term poverty. And I'm like, yeah, that's because there's energy poverty. And that's what you have. And so when the Sri Lankan president embraced and bent the knee to the ESG gods and said, I'm going to be the first ever candidate in 2019 that's a net zero candidate, what happened, and keep in mind that Sri Lanka had one of the highest ESG scores of a country on the face of the earth in 2020. And the Sri Lankan president, in his first year in office, said no more use of nitrogen or fossil fuel-based fertilizer. So they banned the use and importation. And what happened? This is what net zero and ESG results in. It's dangerous and deadly, and quite honestly, it's dumb. But food production went down 40%. The cost went up 80%. And today, 9 in 10 families in Sri Lanka are having issues getting all the meals they need on a daily basis. 9 in 10 families facing hunger every single day in Sri Lanka. This is a company that's on the path to economic prosperity, and we know firsthand, when you have economic prosperity, you have environmental leadership. They were on this incredible path, but you had a presidential leader that bent the knee, and now absolute economic catastrophic failures. didn't even finish his first term in office. You may have seen on the news last year his palace was overrun. And where did he flee to? He didn't go to Malawi. Malawi's at net zero. That's where we're supposed to go. He didn't go to Malawi. He went to Singapore, the highest per capita CO2 emissions on the face of the earth, and one of the cleanest environments. I had the opportunity to visit Singapore in 2016. It was incredible. They retreat their wastewater. I jokingly call it toilet to tap, but it's water. You can clean it, and it'll still be water, and you can consume it. And that's what they do in Singapore. The air quality is incredible. It's a lot like where I was born in Houston. It's extremely humid. But not Malawi. No, the leader didn't go to Malawi. I think he should be relegated to Malawi. I think Bill Gates and those others that are in the climate cult should also be relegated to Malawi. But what's it like at net zero? This is a life at net zero right here. This is a video I like to show about the policies that are driving us towards this lifestyle. And hopefully this will play. Try one more click. There we go. This is Aisha. Aisha's a 13-year-old girl, lives in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is at net zero. What does net zero mean to women? Well, those policies hurt women more than they do men. And women like Aisha will spend 200 million hours today walking to collect water. So a high carbon lifestyle empowers women. 200 million hours a day spent collecting water, something that we take for granted here. We turn on a tap. It's 200 million hours that could be spent civic engagement, getting an education, raising a family. You see that Aisha, 13 years old, spends 8 hours collecting water for her and her family. Yeah, her little brother gets to do homework, but Aisha doesn't get to do homework for 2 reasons. And it's heartbreaking. Number one is she's a female. But number 2 is she's the one that's responsible in the family for collecting water. She'll spend another hour walking around to collect animal dung and biomass to heat that water up to make it somewhat potable. I'm surprised YouTube or UNICEF hasn't pulled this video down, because I'm sure they would never think that someone would use their work to promote fossil fuels, but that's exactly what I do, and I love it. They've got some great content for me. But 8 hours every day. I showed this video to members, Congressman Crenshaw, the Texas congressman, and his staff. Hannah had done missionary work in Ethiopia. And she says, "Oh, do you know what technology the UN provides to girls like Aisha that Bill Gates funds? Long-term and plannable birth control, because they know girls like Aisha are going to be attacked and raped while they're out there collecting water. But no, can't have access to infrastructure if you're investing in fossil fuels." That's the ESG agenda. I call it the China ESG agenda. More on that later. But expensive energy hurts the poor around the world. And it actually hurts the poor right here in the United States. Today, 1 in 6 families over the last 12 months have received a disconnect notice from a utility. There's this incredible lawsuit called the 200 versus the California Air Resources Board. I doubt anyone from the 200 is here at this conference, because it's 200 civil rights organizations that we probably wouldn't ideologically align with. But they're suing the state of California for violating the Civil Rights Act because their environmental policies have a disparate impact on communities of color. And this is just a couple of the quotes from the lawsuit. It's about 80 pages that is just ripe full of talking points. Expensive energy hurts the poor around the world. To lighten things up a little bit, I love to talk to groups, and I love this one because you always see a polar bear at a climate protest. This is one of my favorites. It's like if you see someone and they're holding this sign, take them some water, they're probably getting dehydrated in that suit. They're going to pass out. It's not healthy. I have friends that have done this before, not at a climate protest, but worn those suits like that. It's hot. But I love this because it's like if the polar bears are the barometric measurement of climate change, mission accomplished, we've won, we're done, let's go home and let's worry about lifting the last billion people out of poverty around the face of the earth, because the numbers are inconvenient. In the 60s, there were about 10,000 polar bears. The 60s, there were about 10,000 polar bears on the face of the earth. Today, there's over 40,000 polar bears. We're done. Look at that. Now we're too busy killing whales along the East Coast. I don't see any of those people protesting. What we do to save me? Well, to save the whales, we need to stop the wind, but I digress. But I think this might have something to do with why Russia is invading Ukraine. I mean, there's so many polar bears, they're invading towns now. I mean, this is actually from the news in Russia. Northern Russia is getting attacked by polar bears. There's so many of them. Well, they're bears. They're going to go to where food is. Come on. And where people are, there's usually food and trash. But I try to add a little bit of humor to my talk here, but this might have something to do with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So I digress again. Sorry. You know, James Taylor mentioned AOC last night in his talk, and I don't think it was a lovingly complimentary way he was mentioning her, but just the mere mention of her acronym, if you will. I'm like, oh, I've got to put this slide in my presentation. And I have this envision, I have this goal of bringing AOC and Ted Cruz to the border together in Texas. And let's do the Green New Deal and secure the border at the same time. It's like we can build a wall along the southern border of solar panels. And if we do this, we produce 10% of the electricity that our country produces. 10%, that's pretty significant. And no one will ever cross this border because it will be a mile wide. So let that energy density think in. Of course, the ESG agenda doesn't care about energy density or math or science or facts. It's just about emotions. But a mile wide border of solar panels along the entire southern border would produce 10% of our nation's electricity. That's when the sun is shining, by the way. It's just amazing that people are driving us to this habitat destruction. But I'll keep pushing AOC and Ted Cruz, see if I can get them to the border to do this. Let's talk a little bit more about ESG. I love this one. This was an actual email that a friend of mine was receiving. He was working with Credit Suisse versus Boston on launching a new business, doing an IPO. And he had worked with Credit Suisse for over 20 years, making them millions of dollars and starting successful new public businesses. And he was going for a funding round. And there came up some issues because they were concerned about some of his tweets. Now, this gentleman happens to support Ayn Rand and support groups that align with these free market freedmen principles. And so they tell him that they're a little bit concerned about some of his tweets and that their firm's sustainability committee has some concerns. So look, I love this. Dear Ben, please see the below bullets, which will make sure that our firm's sustainability policy is aligned with yours. By tweeting these, everyone will agree there is no misunderstanding. And they go on and they list the 4 bullet points because he asked them. He was fishing at this point in time. Oh, well, why don't you send me something in an email that you'd like for me to put out? Agree that the company activity should be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Believe that companies should have a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Agree that climate change is occurring and that carbon is contributing to climate change and global warming. Believe that man is contributing to the addition of carbon in the atmosphere. And it says, while I have not gotten sign-off from our firm's sustainability committee, I believe these should work. Using the power of the purse to get people to bend the knee. Well, this gentleman has morals and principles and essentially told them to pound sand, which is interesting because he's in this high-pressure hydraulic fracturing sand business. It told them to pound sand, and look what's happened to Credit Suisse versus Boston over the last couple of years. Like, they're about to be insolvent. They are just losing their minds and their business, jeopardizing people's jobs to worship the false god of net zero and the climate cult. And I refer to net zero as the climate cult's Kool-Aid, and the results are the same. We just had this published on my Substack talking about renewable energy powered by child slaves. This is something the ESG movement doesn't want to talk about, and I've asked BlackRock's officials about this specifically, about them investing in these so-called green energy companies. It's really brown or red energy. 40,000 kids in the Congo between the ages of 4 and 13 years old mining cobalt. 40,000 kids between the ages of 4 and 13. Again, those are some UNICEF numbers. It's absolutely appalling to me. This is where the market distortions from federal governments and the world's largest financial asset managers are driving humanity, not only to live like this, but to work in these kind of conditions. This is absolutely heartbreaking. It's criminal. Again, when do the human rights tribunals begin? I mentioned the China ESG agenda. I just had this published on Fox News yesterday. Some of us were in Indiana testifying a couple of weeks ago in support of legislation. One of the model policies that we have that I believe Paul's going to talk about, I took the first stab of a draft in 2020 of a bill that says if you're going to boycott, divest, or sanction fossil fuels, then you can no longer do business with the state of Texas. I took that draft and gave it to our lieutenant governor's office in Texas, and it became the first bill that passed in the United States, pushing back against woke companies like BlackRock. Well, of course, you got groups like Ceres and the Sunrise Project who contracted with this school at the University of Pennsylvania to write this paper that shows that there could be higher cost by these states like Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma and West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee that are divesting of firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street and other woke financial institutions. There could be higher cost. Well, not if you look at returns from last year, because the top 10 largest ESG funds all had double-digit losses last year. ESG is a scam, quote Elon Musk. And it is true. But the people that were testifying in opposition, the Bankers Association, were citing this study. Which is interesting, and what I write about in this piece on Fox News is that the Wharton School of Business is part of the University of Pennsylvania. And the University of Pennsylvania has taken over $30 million in donations from Chinese donors affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party. And that's maybe why they have this thing called the ESG initiative at the Wharton School of Business, so they can publish garbage to discredit bills that push back against the China ESG agenda and promote affordable, reliable energy from American producers that produce energy more responsibly than anywhere else on the face of the earth. And I'll leave you with this video here. This is just a short minute video. Maybe. I love it when kids say they want to boycott fossil fuels, and I say, well, give me your phone. They lose their minds. And I ask them what else they want to give up. This is good walk-up music for Paul Watkins.